Hi everyone, it's Dr. Wiebrecht here, checking in with you for a continuation of Chapter 6. We're going to talk a little bit more about the functionalist perspective now that we have sort of wrapped up everything that we wanted to talk about in reference to symbolic interactionism and deviance. So this section is sort of interesting. If you remember, functionalists view deviance and anything sort of happening within society as having some type of function. If you remember, we had talked about Emile Durkheim before. He was one of the core sociologists that had evaluated suicide early on in his research. He had also done a considerable amount of work on deviance as well. Now, he viewed deviance through the lens of crime being functional, for it contributes to some type of social order that exists within our society. Deviance, he believes, sort of clarified those moral boundaries. And what do I mean by moral boundaries? Here I'm referencing a group's ideas about how people should act and think. It sort of reaffirms our norms in our everyday life. Deviance also promotes social unity, he believed. Sort of by reacting to deviance, certain group members then develop a we mentality. And we had talked about that us versus them mentality. But here we're talking about a we mentality, where we collectively affirm that this is the right way to do things, and that this is how we should all behave in a sense. Deviance also promotes social change. So if those boundary violations gain enough support, they become new acceptable behaviors. We had talked slightly about, somebody had brought up in one of the discussions about same-sex relationships as being deviant in our society at times. What's interesting is that you can begin to see a generational change at times with this. And how we have seen that is that as it becomes more individuals maybe find it acceptable, in a sense, within a society, you're going to start to see that some of those boundaries begin to soften, and not necessarily that they aren't less deviant, but just that, in a sense, it can promote social change, that something that might used to be deviant is maybe considered not so much anymore. A good example is we had talked about, the bus subway riders that sort of wore no pants on certain days once a year, just as an annual event. Some individuals might view that as deviant in a sense. Here, this is in Great Britain, where individuals will actually wear pumpkins and walk around naked as well. Again, it's sort of challenging those boundaries as what's acceptable, what's the norms in that sense. You'll also see a naked bike race happening down in New Orleans as well once a year. We look at deviance with that mindset that, everybody has a relative nature to it. What is acceptable to you? What's acceptable to me? And how do we interpret that within these certain groups? Functionalists here believe that every society has some type of boundary that divides what's considerable acceptable to what's not. And I think that that's really appropriate, is that we know that each society as well has those sort of moral boundaries that sort of play a part. And of course, you're going to have groups that unify over what's correct and what's not. Robert Merton was another sociologist I want you guys to sort of become familiar with. He developed something called the strain theory. Here we're analyzing what happens when people are socialized to desire cultural goals, but denied necessarily the institutionalized means to reach them. So Merton used anonymy, in a sense, which is one of Durkheim's terms, to refer to the strain people experience when they are blocked in their attempts to achieve those goals. So what do I mean by that? The most common reaction to cultural goals and institutionalized means is conformity, right? Using some type of lawful means to seek goals society sets. We say this with individuals that perhaps break the law in a sense. We know that there's sometimes legal ramifications if somebody doesn't behave or comply with that. So we're going to sort of break this down by 4 specific deviant paths. He identified those 4 types of deviant responses to anonymy. The first one is innovation. Here we're using illegitimate means to achieve them. You know, regardless of people's personal opinion, look at somebody who's a drug dealer or engaging in certain types of crime. We know that we don't condone those kind of behaviors, but we know that that individual that is engaging in that is using some type of innovation in order to reach some type of goal or success within their own mindset. The second here is ritualism. We're giving up on achieving cultural goals, but clinging to conventional rules of conduct. The third is retreatism. Here we're rejecting cultural goals while also dropping out. Think about high school. We know that that's a cultural goal, is to graduate from high school, but we do have individuals that reject that in a sense. And finally, rebellion, seeking to replace society's goals all in all. So when we look at the strain theory, remember that deviants are not pathogenic individuals, but they are the products of our society. This can vary depending upon how we view what's deviant at that point in time. So if society's saying that this is deviant, people might veer a completely different way. And so that's really important as we look at this. I also want you guys to understand, we've talked a couple about the functions of sociology. Deviance in the terms of sociology, let me say that. There are two specific sociologists. One is Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin. They believed and they developed something called the illegitimate opportunity theory to explain why social classes have such distinct styles of crime. And I really think it's important for us to look at this from the lens of social classes. We know that social classes here means that they have access or means to certain types of things, right? And I think that that's really important. These differences are due to that differential access to those institutionalized means. Maybe it's education, maybe it's money, maybe it's employment opportunities, that type of thing. Illegitimate opportunity structures are opportunities for crimes, okay, like robbery, burglary, drug dealing, that are sort of woven into our everyday life, right? These structures, a lot of times, can result when a legitimate structure fails, in a sense, right? We know that certain systems within our society are not perfect. We have certain things to set in motion to protect from crime happening, but we know that there are still gaps within the system where drug dealing and robbery and burglary and certain types of crime still exist within it. So let's look at it from an example. For the urban poor, there are opportunities to make money through something, you guys probably hear the term hustle, right? Here, robbery, burglary, drug dealing, maybe prostitution, pimping, gambling, and of course, a list of other types of crimes. That hustler, in a sense, is a role model because he or she is one of the few who comes close to those cultural goals of success, right? We look at success maybe a little differently when we're looking at a different social class. Think about it. That drug dealer, that person that gambles or whoever, maybe that individual that has a long history of committing crimes might be very successful in what they do because they're able to achieve certain types of success goals in their own mindset. Maybe it's having a nice car, a nice house, having money in their pocket, right? Maybe they're just very well known within the community, despite maybe engaging in illegal activity, right? On the other hand, when we're looking at social class, the other one is called white-collar crime. These are crimes that people of respectable and high social status commit in the course of their occupation, right? So here we have something that's resulting from an illegitimate opportunity structure among higher classes. What's interesting is these crimes exist in greater numbers than what we even really necessarily perceive. And they can be very costly and a lot of times can possibly total several $100 billion a year. So understand that in white-collar crime, you're going to find that they involve physical harm, sometimes even death. An example would be unsafe working conditions. A lot of times can kill about 100,000 Americans each year, or about 5 times the number of people killed by street crime. in the example on the slide that you see, white collar crime here, the Ford executives had kept faulty Firestone tires for their Explorers. I don't know if you remember when all this was going down, but as a result of that, there were 200 people that ended up losing their lives because of these faulty tires. Now, understand that not one Ford executive spent a single day in jail. Why is that? Because a lot of times in white-collar crime, those individuals are going to have access, because they are from a higher social class, that they have access to different means and resources than what individuals from a perhaps urban poor or a much lower social class are going to, right? They can afford that really nice attorney that's going to be ruthless in the courtroom, or they're going to be able to, pay things off or different access to means. Maybe they have connections and higher resources in different places as a result of that. What we begin to see with the functionalist perspective is that there have been recent changes in the nature of what's viewed as crime. We had begin to see that, functions can exist in almost every aspect of crime. One of which is gang culture, which we're going to talk about later this upcoming week here. Because you're going to find that a lot of times gang culture, there are individuals within that gang community that might be engaging in other things, right? And you're going to start to see in the video that I show you about the Bloods and the Crips that those individuals who originally started gangs did not have the same intention of what it was and eventually emerges to in what we think of it today. So it's always sort of interesting to look at from that perspective. A major change is the growing ranks of female offenders. And as women have become more involved in professions in the corporate world, you're going to see that they're enticed by those illegitimate opportunities as well. This particular slideshow talks about what state is the safest in reference to violent crimes in the U.S. What's interesting is that you're going to start to see that Maine, let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. Maine has one of the highest safest numbers, as well as Vermont and New Hampshire. 3 of the most dangerous, Tennessee, Alaska, and South Carolina. Why? Really good question, and I want you guys to think about that, because these images help a lot of times when we look at it, because you're like, well, look at where Pennsylvania is versus Alaska. That's sort of interesting. What could be going on in that particular state? What's happening there that we begin to look at this stuff a little bit more closely? This slideshow talks about what I had just talked in reference to about the growing ranks of female offenders. We're going to start to see from 92 to 2012, and of course even up to current day, those statistics are slowly growing for women that are engaging in illegitimate crime opportunities. So you're going to see burglary on the rise, drunken driving, car theft, stolen property, those types of things. The only one in which did not see a major jump initially was fraud. But even today, you're going to start to see those numbers spike again with recent data. So that sort of wraps up the functionalist perspective of things. I want to talk briefly about the conflict perspective. Again, if you remember, the concept